Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Sholan Booysen. Sholan, how are you?
Hey Nick, I'm doing good as always, and yeah, I'm excited for the episode ahead. Know we have a lot of stuff to discuss, and we'll probably have a lot of laughs as well.
Indeed, there's a whole bunch of wacky stuff on the agenda today. We're also joined today by Sara. Sara, how are you?
I'm well. In fact, I'm sorry we've had to trim the subject list down.
Yeah, it's
just
surprising
crazy it
how
doesn't
little
begin
you.
to cover it.
Exactly, it's amazing how you can't fit everything into half an hour. But anyway, let's do our best. So the first story I think we just need to talk about, and I don't think there's too much to be said here, but it's just rather darkly funny, is that the ANC has warned all of its members that they are not allowed to pay for the upkeep of their voting delegates. They've made it expressly clear that no one at the ANC conference is allowed to be bribed. Over 4,000 delegates from across the country are going to be gathering in Gauteng next month for a 4-day national elective conference where Ramaphosa and all the other senior leaders of the ANC will be up for some sort of election. The ANC says it has introduced measures to limit the influence of money on its elective conferences. And their head of the secretary for the electoral committee said nobody is allowed to pay for any expenses for any delegates whatsoever. Going into the conference, you can't pay for accommodation, you can't pay for registration, you can't pay for food, you can't pay for alcohol, you can't do anything. Sara, I'm tempted to just laugh for about a minute and then stop the topic right there and move on to the next one. But do you have anything to add on this one?
Well, I'm actually quite impressed because I thought they would have said you may not be bribed for more than 200,000 rand in this conference.
No, they've taken a hard line. No bribery
whatsoever.
Taken a
hard line. No bribery whatsoever. And that will be observed mostly in the breach. That's all there is to be said.
Yes. Sholan, any thoughts on whether the ANC will be able to stick to their no bribes policy for their elective conference?
Hey Nick, they really can't be expecting us to believe the fact that there will be no vote buying, that money won't have any influence, or that there will be no bribery at the conference. I think at this point, it's not even an elective conference, it's more of a vote buying contest. Whoever has the most money, you are most likely to succeed. I'm just thinking back to when Ramaphosa was campaigning. The last time it was during CR17 campaign, and the reports of $1 billion rand that he has spent on buying votes or whatever the case may be, and then he comes out and he's like, "No, guys, it was not the $1 billion rand. It was merely 300 million rand that he used on his campaign." And I'm like, what is the difference even? And I don't think anyone is convinced that 300 million rand went to posters and, a lot of Ramaphosa merchandise. I'm not convinced that was the complete story. So, yeah, I think it's really unfortunate. And we are likely to see a repeat of that.
That may be more than, or at least a significant proportion of the ANC's election budget for when it fights a national election. Anyway, just completely ridiculous. They don't have any credibility on this issue whatsoever. And don't take our word for it. Minister Lindiwe Sisulu said as much herself. She said that in the ANC, the one with the biggest purse has the most votes.
Actually, I think they may be right. I think that they said they may not bribe anyone at the electoral conference, but does it prevent them from bribing them before the electoral conference?
You got to do it in the parking lot. Exactly.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay, let's move on to interesting things abroad. And this one is, I think, it's quite a good contrast between sort of pretending to be an activist and actually being an activist for human rights. And this is the case of the protesting soccer teams. So the English football team, which I think it was on Tuesday, played against Iran. In the lead up to their playing in the Qatari World Cup, there was much song and dance about them wearing a patch on their arms of part of their uniform. It was going to be a heart with, I think, the rainbow colors of the LGBT flag, as well as the sort of Pan-Africanist colors as well, to symbolize, respect for marginalized groups or something like that. It was supposed to be a very kind of generic, bland statement that in the West, you would sort of just, blink your eyes at and say, oh, well, I guess they're just doing that now. But FIFA, in the lead up to the contest, said, no, the Qataris don't want you wearing any political armbands, particularly since they are a country where homosexuality is a crime punishable by death. So you're not allowed to wear those patches. And if you do wear them, we'll give you and your whole team yellow cards. And promptly, the spirit of activism and human rights defending in the English team seems to have evaporated. And they all subsequently took said patches off their uniforms. However, in contrast, at the very same time, the Iranian soccer team did something that was genuinely very brave. Right now, and we'll get into this, I think, there are big protests in Iran, and the government is repressing those protests with an enormous amount of violence. At least 15,000 people have been arrested so far, and estimates are very difficult to come by, but there's at least probably around 500 people who have been killed in the suppression of these protests against the Iranian state. Every single one of the Iranian soccer players refused to sing the national anthem of Iran, and in a press conference afterwards expressed their support for the protests at home. This is despite the fact that when they return back from the Qatari World Cup, they may indeed face serious punishment from the Iranian regime, particularly if it survives the protests. Sara, what do you make of all of this? I think it's an interesting contrast between, those who are really willing to put it on the line for a political cause and those who are just sort of pretending.
Well, I think the biggest lesson should be to those in the West who think there are 1,000 causes and grievances that they should express a program towards and tie themselves to buildings and fix themselves to the roads and so on and so forth. And then I think the English team even took the knee. I mean, it's what I call virtue signaling on the world stage. It really and truly is. And it looks, to use a good English word, so naff compared to what is essentially a really meaningful protest by the Iranians. And it may not look or sound like much, but the panning across the faces of the Iranians as they were not singing. I mean, it struck me. I didn't actually know what was happening. And I realized what over the time when I saw some of the officials singing, that I realized what was happening. And the point is that they are not going to get a fine for £100 and told to, go home and behave nicely. One protester has been executed by the Iranians, and apparently 19 or 20 more are under threat of execution. That's what I call a problem. And I think it's pause for thought that right. In the West,
and on top of that, if I may just quickly interrupt you, the Iranian parliament, which is not a real representative organization, doesn't actually represent the Iranian people properly, voted recently that the protests should be dealt with harshly and probably all of them should be executed, just to be on the safe side.
And they mean it. I mean, there are no women to be seen in the parliament, as far as I know, which would be, the status of women in Qatar is open to question as well. And, Iran gets away with enriching uranium, a massive funder to terrorist organizations, selling weaponry and drones to the Russians. That's where the issues are. And I think the West should actually be quite ashamed at the fact that it's essentially playing the equivalent of nursery school games on the world stage.
So I'm not a huge fan of some of these kinds of protests, but I think that in Qatar they really would have, wearing something that declares your support for LGBT people in Qatar is a really good and brave thing to do, because it is a place where human rights are seriously discriminated against. It is a place where gay people have to fear for their lives every single day as a result of state violence. And yet, when push came to shove, no, then suddenly, okay, no, we're not going to do anything. Sholan, what do you make of this whole mess?
Yeah, no, Nick, as somebody who is a very big supporter of football, I watch the English Premier League a lot, and it immediately reminded me of the Black Lives Matter protest that was occurring in the Premier League during that period, where all these soccer players were, taking the knee in support of this, and they didn't really receive a lot of resistance for their social awareness or their activism. But the moment they arrive in a rather challenging environment and they're receiving, a challenge or backlash for their beliefs or their political beliefs, in this case for supporting the LGBTQ community, immediately when they received this backlash, they completely folded. I mean, in this case, the Iranians were standing up for a cause that could have potentially mean their death. These soccer players from England are scared of a yellow card, and they just completely folded. At the same time, I also find it rather weird that, they complain to be so socially aware, whatever term they'd like to use, but instead they tell them where they could have forfeited, they could have stayed away from the competition completely in disagreement. I mean, that would be noble. They would have forfeited a source of income, revenue, money that they would have generated. But instead they are telling the world, you know what? Let me go and fight for your rights in Qatar, on the battlefield, while I'm bagging probably millions of dollars. And I just find that quite ironic. They're like, let me go fight for your rights while I'm gaining so much money from it, and then I'll fold the minute there is resistance against it, and it clearly exposes them. And this is something that occurs. We experience it in South Africa, in the Western world, across the board, that the minute there is resistance, either ideological, intellectual resistance, or in whatever form, they fold on their cause. And I think that is a true testament of what they actually believe. Because if this was something, a hill they were willing to die on, taking a yellow card and being excluded from the competition would have meant nothing for them. But clearly, this is clearly just a show of force. It's a performance. That's what it is.
Performance.
Yeah, very disappointing. And something we should also just talk about is the protests in Iran as well, which are continuing to, by all accounts, gather strength. I listened to a podcast from, I think it's the Critical Threats program in the US. Their main spokesperson was on, and he said that I think this week the protests against the regime, which began after what is very likely the beating to death of a woman for not wearing her hijab correctly by the morality police in Iran, seem to have grown even larger and continue to grow larger, something like 50 days after they began, which is quite impressive. Often, Iran has been shaken by major protests against the regime. Iran has the sort of semblance of a democratic structure, but in reality, it's not a real democracy. Although people are allowed to vote for who they want, in terms of the vote is not controlled when it comes to the elections. The candidates are. The clergy of Iran selects the candidates who are acceptable to them. And so you're only allowed to choose between two different flavors of hardline Islamist clerisy when it comes to your choices in an Iranian election. So as a result, the people don't have a proper way of expressing their discontent with the government, and there have been protests in the big ones in 2009. There were also some in the 2010s and another big wave of them in 2019. But every time they've been crushed. However, these ones seem to have reached the biggest size and are continuing to gain strength. So there could be very interesting news coming out from Iran soon. And this is despite the fact that there has, as I said earlier, been extreme violence against the Iranian people who have been protesting. Machine guns used on crowds, lots of reports of torture and sexual violence used against protesters, just every kind of awful thing you can imagine. It's very difficult to say what will come next, because unlike a lot of these protest movements, there doesn't appear to be a clear leader or ideology beyond we don't like the current regime. So what comes next is very unsure, or even, maybe the Iranian regime will survive. It's survived a lot of protests in the past. Sara, your thoughts on the ongoing protests in Iran?
Yeah, there seems to be one factor that is different to many of the preceding protests, and that is that a lot of the people who are protesting would otherwise have been perhaps more tolerant of the regime, in that they are the poorer part of Iranian society. But I think they are hurting so much economically that they are partly very much giving voice and muscle to these protests, and that's what makes the difference. In other words, it's not the middle class, which traditionally it has been. a lot of these protesters are poor, and that might make a difference. I see that a former football player, captain of the Iranian team, is one of the sort of well-known figures in the protests. And it may well be you may see a sort of coalescing around someone like him, because movements like this do need a face. I know that's very dangerous, but they do need at least one face for people to coalesce around. And that's probably the one way that these protests could progress to something more than just, sort of violently opposed protests by the regime that could actually have an effect. But that's, as you say, it's sort of still up in the air and they're ongoing. But the length of the protests suggests that there is a whole lot more at play against the regime than has happened before.
Right. And the consequences would be pretty profound for geopolitics, because Iran has been very aggressive on the world stage over the last few years. So if the Islamic Republic collapses, it's very difficult to see what happens in the next few steps. Indeed, what will replace it. We may also see separatist movements as well, because the protests began in the Kurdish region of Iran, which is in the west. I believe the lady who was killed, Masha Amini, was Kurdish herself. And they're very much not just located within that region. They've spread to the whole country, and they're generally sort of multi-ethnic. But I wouldn't be surprised if separatist movements try and take advantage of all this. Anyway, it's probably going to be messy. Sholan, very briefly, any more thoughts on the Iranian protests?
Yeah, no, Nick, something that while I was, just like researching like what's been happening in the country in Iran, is that something interesting that unlike many of the Arabic countries, the interesting thing that I actually found out was that Iran itself, like Persia, that region, actually has a very secular history, if I'm correct, Nick. I'm open to correction here. That actually has a secular history, and that is not actually deeply rooted Islamic beliefs or religious beliefs in its society.
There's a very interesting thing that you can see in Iran. If you go and look at pictures before the Islamic Revolution in 1979, and you look at pictures of Iranian women and that kind of thing in the streets of Tehran, no one is wearing headscarves. People are on the beach in bikinis, that kind of thing. And then within a few years, the Islamic Revolution happens, because there is a genuinely, I think, religious conservative side to that country. But it's very much in conflict with the sort of more Western-looking city population.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And that's why I also think that Iran specifically finds itself in a position where it's very susceptible to that historical factor, unlike what, for example, it was occurring in Saudi Arabia, who has deeply Islamic roots. And that's why I think that's also one of probably the weaknesses that the country has, that, people should become more aware of the fact that, this is actually not this authoritarian style of government and oppressiveness to women is not necessarily something that was a part of the history. And I think that many of these propagandists or people who are advocating that there should be more freedoms in this country should probably be making use of that as an historical point in the activities. I really think that's a strong point for them to be making. And yeah, I hope that eventually that what occurs there will probably be more freedom for the women, because I've seen some horrific things happen to these people on YouTube and all of these platforms has really been exposing these things that's actually occurring, and it will, as yourself and Sara say, have enormous geopolitical consequences what occurs inside of the country. And that's what's definitely something to watch, Nick.
Last thing to just say on this topic is that the Iranian government has in the past been able to partially quash the protests by shutting off the internet, and they keep doing that now as well. But it doesn't seem to be working yet, which is very interesting. Anyway, let us go on to our next topic. And we're coming back to South Africa now for one of the most troubled municipalities in the country. Maluti Apofong, which is the municipality where Harrismith is in the Free State, has long had many problems. The water stopped in the town for a while. They have big problems with electricity. The water had to be repaired by individual citizens, local farmers working together with people from the township there had to basically put up their own money and time and expertise to actually fix the water system in that town. It was a terribly run municipality, and the ANC lost control of it in 2021, which is one of the more interesting stories actually of our last local government election. And a complicated coalition of very small parties you've probably never heard of took power in the municipality. So the municipality is governed by a coalition of the MAP 16 civic movement, which is made up originally of, I believe, a bunch of ANC councillors who were thrown out of the ANC for opposing Ace Magashule. The EFF, the Dinkwankatwela Party, which I've never heard of, the African Transformation Movement, which is that party that Jimmy Manyi runs, the AIC, which is that strange party from the Eastern Cape, and the South African Royal Kingdoms Organization. They were also, although not forming part of the government, they were supported against motions of no confidence by the DA, who has one councillor, and the Freedom Front Plus, who also, I believe, has one councillor in the municipality. However, despite many hopes that losing the ANC in control of that municipality would turn things around, it seems as though the municipality is really struggling. Employees of the municipality are not going to be receiving their salaries this month, but have been assured by the political leadership that they will be reimbursed in staggered payments. A notice from the municipality issued on Monday said the municipality finds itself in difficult cash flow position due to non-payment of services and continued vandalism of electricity infrastructure. The notice said, quote, "We are therefore unable to pay employees and councillors," so that's also the politicians, "on November 23rd. Employees will be paid according to their post-level categories, starting from post-level 15 upwards. We apologize for the inconvenience caused. Thank you in advance." The DA councillor is a woman called Alison Oates, hit out at the government saying, "The latest financial reports made available to the Finance Section 80 Committee are from the first month of the financial year, July 2020. Even then it was obvious a crisis was looming. We warned that the budget was unrealistic and illegal. The budget was eventually accepted on the promise that all political parties would support a financial recovery plan. Regrettably, this did not occur." Sara, what do you make of this? It's an interesting lesson for how simply removing the ANC from power really doesn't necessarily change things unless you actually change the policies by which government is run. What do you make of this?
But it's more than that. I think it's a lesson in that coalitions are the future, but you can only have a coalition up to a point. If you have too many parties, nothing coalesces. And particularly in an environment like in a rural district, you have a whole lot of people and parties you don't know. So in other words, people are forming parties for either good or bad reasons, and every reason in between, but don't necessarily know the first thing about governing a municipality. So you may not have the skills, you may not have the sense of policies. Some of those people are the ATM, the AIC, those sort of people have been around the block, and they're not exactly whiter than the driven snow, shall we say. So that whole combination of not enough skills, too many parties, too fractured, too few representatives is what could really make some coalitions unworkable. There is a limit. You splitting the vote too much could end up, splitting the ability to run the environment at all.
So Sholan, I think a lot about 2024 these days and what our next election is going to look like. And of course, it's possible that the ANC will very likely, in fact, I would say the ANC is going to fall below 50% in those national elections. If that happens, I suspect that any anti-ANC coalition that comes to power is probably going to include these parties you've never heard of. A lot of analysts, ourselves included, like to talk about the DA, we like to talk about Action SA, we like to talk about the EFF. We know these parties, they're big, we know their faces, we know who's who, what they, or at least what they claim to stand for, that kind of stuff. But I suspect that the key to any anti-ANC coalition is probably going to be a party like the ABC, who you may never have heard of, but have some seats in KZN, or the South African Royal Kingdoms Organization, who I haven't heard of. In fact, I believe they may only have seats here in Muluti Upper Form. And I wouldn't be surprised if these little parties capture a seat here, a seat there, based off of their support located in one area. How do you think that's going to play into coalition negotiations in 2024?
Yeah, Nick, I can guarantee you that it will definitely not be making it any easier. That's one thing that we know for sure. And what tends to also be a problem is that with these parties that you say that we might not hear of, it might be one specific figure, running this political party. We do not necessarily know what the ideological foundation might be, or even what the policy proposals are, because it tends to be surrounded about one personality figure. That tends to be the case a lot. And
or one locality or something.
Yes, exactly. They do not necessarily have a vision, a national vision, other than their specific community or region where they stay. That tends to be the case a lot. And what we also see, for example, if we just take it back to what happened in Johannesburg, is that we saw the effect that one political party had with a few seats. In many times, one seat has the ability to disrupt the entire coalition or the entire arrangement of government in that specific region. And that could start to occur at the provincial and at the national level when we go into 2024. And something also, Nick, that I've started noticing around what these political leaders, whether it's Herman Masaba, John Steenhuisen, Helen Zille, these opposition leaders, one thing that they've started to clearly state, they make it clear right now, is that just because the ANC is removed or the ANC becomes in an opposition party in 2024, national or provincial, it will not mean that a snap of a finger that the issues happening in the municipalities, in these governments, in the national government will just simply disappear. But the rot and the decay is of such a magnitude that it might take 5 to 10 years to rectify, or even longer to rectify and change the direction of the decline. And they are being realistic, and I think that's something. It's one of the things we can finally admire, is that they are being honest, that they will not come 2024 within snap of the election and everything will be, and South Africa will be paradise. That is an honest thing to rectify. However, I must say that this issue with the municipality is happening across multiple spheres of government. It's happening at the national and at the provincial. And there's two things that the governments are faced with. Firstly, there tends to be a situation where the public service, the civil service, is so enormous, and this public wage bill is extremely massive, because people are being hired not because of their skill or their professionalism. It tends to be based on their loyalty to the specific political parties and the individuals who are put into place, who are elected. That tends to be the case why they get jobs. And now you have this massive wage bill that cannot be paid. It's just not sustainable. And then another situation that we see in this scenario is that there are services that are being paid, Nick, where the people who are supposed to be executing these services simply either do not exist or they simply cannot execute it. And it's a terrible situation. I think in the article it made a reference to a ghost service. It's a ghost service provider where the services are being paid, but these people do not exist. And
not just Brasso that has a problem with ghosts.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And we don't need to look on a national profile, we don't need to look any further than Eskom to see exactly how this occurs, where there is ghost service providers and a civil service that is overstaffed. And yeah, it's really it doesn't make the situation easier. But Nick, we're definitely gonna have to hope for the best and vote properly to make sure that this small, fragmented, extremely fragmented, I should rather say, scenario does not occur at the national level, especially if we want a government where the EFF and ANC are excluded. Yeah.
So just as part of that, I want to just give people very quickly before we close a brief idea of how many little parties there are that in the last election showed that they're actually able to win a seat here or there. So you just need to look no further than the eThekwini Municipal Council, where a whole host of parties that you've probably never heard of managed to win seats. So I'll just read out some of them. These are ones that I haven't heard of. The Active Citizens Coalition, the Justice and Employment Party, the Minorities of South Africa Party, the People's Revolutionary Movement, the Truly Alliance, KZN Independence, People's Freedom Party, African People First, and Al Jamaah. You've probably heard of, but they only got a seat in just there at the end. The ANC laptops. Anyway, Sara, final thoughts before we close up.
I think, really sort of summing up what Sholan's been saying is that the legacy left by the ANC is deeper, wider, and thicker and nastier than sometimes we even think of. It's the cargo deployment, the BEE, the desire to the patronage, the lack of development of skills, the overemployment of people. A lot of the stuff can be fixed, but as Sholan says, we must have no quick expectations. It'll happen in pockets and it'll happen over time, but it is going to be very, very tough because expectations have got to be tempered. There's no doubt about it. We have such a big hole to dig ourselves out of.
Indeed. So just a reminder, the Daily Friends show will have its last episode of the year on the 30th of November. So do tune in for that. We might also have a special, depending on if we have enough time to record it before the end of the year. But anyway, with that, I hope you all have a wonderful day and we'll see you tomorrow. Cheers, everyone.